Computer. Hey, everybody. This is, maybe the beginning of our kind of reading groups. We've done a lot before, but systematically, this is the idea is I like the idea of articles and chapters and then the occasional book. And so for this one, I suggested the first chapter of this book, Godhead and the Nothing by Altizer. So the way we'll do this is I will kind of say a few words about it. I'll talk for maybe 10, 15 minutes, and then we'll just open it up to a broader conversation. Before I do, I am interested in how people find this chapter. If anybody briefly wants to say, did anybody find it completely not understandable or very easy to understand or somewhere in the middle? We've got a couple of academics in this group, so we'll probably find it easier. But yeah, what was your experience of reading Altizer? Anybody want to jump in?
I'll jump in. There were several points where I was enthusiastically nodding along and saying, yes, this exactly. And there were a great many sections where I thought to myself, I have no idea what he's talking about.
Yes.
So it was kind of somewhere in the middle.
Yeah. Anybody else have a similar experience? I find that with Altizer, some people like his style of writing, some people don't. It's often very bombastic. This is him at his best, I think. He's not being as bombastic as he usually is, where every other word is apocalypse and that kind of thing. But yeah.
Yeah, for me, I know the chapter was on the name of God, but yeah, he just tried to connect a lot of things in that chapter. So I guess that's where the depths kind of just could go either way, and kind of could be could be lost. But I guess that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
But yeah.
It's a fun place to get lost in. Yeah. I think Altizer is a fun forest to be lost in. Yeah. Okay. I'll say a few words then, and then we'll kick in. I feel like I understand what Altizer's doing and what he's doing in this chapter, but also I could be wrong and definitely open to other people's interpretations here. So please feel free to take it in different directions. But I will try to, in a nutshell, tell you what I kind of get out of it. And in a way, this is a great way of maybe understanding Altizer's work as a whole. I mean, if you understand this chapter, this might give you a little snapshot into his importance as a theologian and his mission as a theologian. So basically, right, let's kick off. He is arguing that Christianity in particular is a very dualistic type of thinking, right? And Western thought has been very much dualistic and about overcoming dualisms, but more so than other traditions that are non-dualistic or whatever. Says that there's this, he's kind of almost, people critique Christianity and the Western tradition for being dualistic, but yeah, you're knocking on an open door with Altizer. He's going, yep, it is absolutely. And however, what Altizer is arguing for, and you'll get this because most of you have been working on this stuff for years, there's a very Hegelian dimension to this, which is you have a position that generates its negation, and then that generates a negation of negation, what he calls the coincidence of opposites, which is pretty much, I read that as pretty much what we can talk about is the negation of negation, and I'll unpack that a little bit more now. But so I've been reading Simone Weil alongside Altizer in the last few weeks, and one of the interesting things about Weil's metaphysics, let's call it, which might help to make sense of her seemingly contradictory kind of writings on God, is in her kind of like creation myth. Let's imagine that before the Big Bang, right? What is before the Big Bang? And so for Weil, it's that which is pre-subject and object. So we can't actually think it. It is all space, all time. It is everything and simultaneously nothing, because it is pure being without any characteristics. And if you have pure being without any characteristics, so if you have a computer and you take away every characteristic of what it is to be a computer, you're left with nothing. So ironically, being and nothing, pre-subject and object, are kind of one and the same. So we can almost try to get our head around this idea of kind of space and time are completely filled or completely irrelevant. There is no emptiness. There is a some no thing, right? We can't even conceptualize it. It's the groundless ground of being. It's the pre-subject object. And then Simone Weil's creation story is fascinating. That there are versions of this in philosophical traditions, but it's not very common, which is the idea that for God to create, the first thing God has to do is die, is contract, because there's no space to create anything, right? God is all in all, everything and nothing or whatever. So there's no space. So the first thing God has to do is contract, so that not to create nothing, basically, which then becomes creation. And in this story that she tells, the first act of God is to die as God. God, the first choice of God is this absolute pre-subject object, groundless ground of being, whatever you want to say, is to die, to canonically self-empty, so that creation comes into being. Therefore, Simone Weil has a type of theological atheism, because God has died, right at the begin, like the beginning of the universe is the death of God. And then for Weil, the death of God in Christ is an echo of the original death of the Father in the universe. So these are connected. But what we see in the kenotic self-emptying of Christ is a repetition of the kenotic self-emptying of God. And Weil has a very interesting way of thinking about God and whatever from that. And I would like to do some Weil in the coming months. But it's not dissimilar to Altizer, in the sense that from the very beginning of Christianity, then there's these dichotomies between the infinite and the finite, between the transcendent and the immanent, between being and nothing, whatever you want to say, like these dichotomies, flesh and spirit, are everywhere. But in true Hegelian style, they unravel. And as most of you have done Atheism for Lent, I think all of you have maybe, you know this structure, right? So Atheism for Lent is based on this idea that an affirmation kind of becomes its own negation, and then that negation is negated, it becomes something else, right? So this is a kind of process that Altizer affirms. And in this chapter, the way I read it, and I'm, please do bring out stuff that I don't see or critique me, but the way I see it is he's going, atheism is one of the great negations of theism. Oh, part of the chapter, and you'll have noticed this, is he talks about heresy and orthodoxy as being part of Christianity. They're both necessary, that orthodoxy generates heresy, which then, generates forward momentum. So these opposites are intertwined. And so much so that when you push the negation, the opposite, to its extreme, it becomes a new beginning. And this is what he means by apocalypse. So what is an apocalypse, which is a word he uses all the time? In the context of this chapter, an apocalypse is an absolute end that is simultaneously an absolute beginning. An end of one economic epoch or political epoch or social epoch that is simultaneously the start of something else. I was trying to think of an example, and I think a good example in psychoanalysis is where Zizek talks about and Lacan talks about that the prohibition of enjoyment becomes the enjoyment of prohibition. So whenever you prohibit your enjoyment and become a nun or a monk or whatever it is, and remove yourself from society or sacrifice for your family, and you prohibit your enjoyment, this becomes, when you push it to its extreme, it becomes the enjoyment of prohibition. And that's a different type of enjoyment. So it's an absolute end. You prohibit your enjoyment, becomes an absolute beginning, and enjoyment of prohibition. Something arises out of it. And in a similar way, this coincidence of opposites is the apocalyptic moment. When you push a negative, a negation, as far as you can, it becomes positivized in a new way. That one quick metaphor for that is if you have $100 in the bank and you negate it, you take the $100 out, that's negation. And if you then withdraw another $100, that's a kind of negation, which positivizes the negative. It doesn't become positive and it doesn't become $100, it becomes minus $100. So it's a negative that is positivized, it's a negative that is something. And so what Altheiser's partly doing in this chapter is he's playing around with all of these dichotomies, this coincidence of opposites, but ultimately trying to say that in the modern world, and maybe we can date that to the Enlightenment, 16th century, 1600s or whatever, but the modern world, there has been this negation of theism. One of the things that marks modernity is atheism as a legitimate, or is it the driving intellectual and artistic expression, right? And it's what drives a lot of the developments in science and in the arts and literature and philosophy. It's a very productive negation. And then Altheiser is basically suggesting that all of the responses to this negation, kind of like anemic Christian responses, are never give us anything very effective. So you've got evangelicalism, you've got fundamentalism, you've got creationism, you've got different ways in which kind of like the institution has tried to fight back against atheism, tried to put up a wall, tried to stop this torrent of negation from happening. And of course, some people are influenced by it, some people take it up, but it's not, he calls it universal, it's not significant, right? So creationism does not add anything significant to the scientific endeavor, right? Or to, evangelicalism has had minimal impact in terms of literature and the arts, right? There may be a few examples, a few exceptions, but in general, right, these movements have not been the zeitgeist. They haven't caught the imaginations of the greatest artists, and the greatest musicians, and the greatest intellectuals of an epoch, right? They are more like little small enclaves, right? And then Altheiser, even at the beginning of this chapter, says that there's no real 20th century theologian who's given a really good substantive conception of God, right? Now, what the 20th century has given us is some great theologians and philosophers who negate God and even theologically negate God. So Dietrich Bonhoeffer, at the end of his life, is starting to write in prison that basically he wants to give up entirely God. But he wants to give up entirely God for the sake of God. And that he thinks that in giving up God completely and becoming secular, a new vision or understanding of God will arise, right? So that's what Bonhoeffer's doing in Letters and Papers from Prison. At the very end, he's saying, I want to give up God entirely. But because to give up God entirely, to canonically self-empty of God, of divinity, is weirdly doing a repetition of God, right? We get God of creation or God of crucifixion, right? And as something else might arise. And Paul Tillich does the same thing at the very end of The Courage to Be. Paul Tillich says that when you go into the heart of nihilism and fully embrace the lack of meaning, a new God can arise. So they're not even saying what this God is going to be, but you see in the 20th century already this kind of idea among the great thinkers of God that we shouldn't defend ourselves against atheism. We shouldn't defend ourselves against nihilism. We shouldn't defend ourselves against meaninglessness, but rather see that as arising out of the Christian tradition. And by the way, that's quite common a view now within the academy, even with kind of normal academics will say that secularism smoothly grew out of Christianity, right? So that's that. I think, a lot of sociologists argue that, but so Altizer says atheism in a way comes out of theism and out of Christianity, and should be fully embraced, fully gone into, fully entered into, and here's the trick: the negation of God becomes the God of negation. So in the same way that I said, the prohibition of enjoyment becomes the enjoyment of prohibition, the negation of God, when you go fully into the negation of God, we encounter this idea of God as negation itself. And that, I think, is Altizer's project, is to say that this approach and understanding of God has the potential to have the same power as old conceptions of God had with Thomas Aquinas or whatever, right? This has the potential of being at the forefront of civilization and connect with science and connect with mathematics and connect with literature and connect with art, and uh, is also in continuity with the very logic of Christ, the very Christological logic of negation, kenotic, self-emptying, being the manifestation of the divine. Okay, I'm going to stop there for now. That's my opening gambit. At any point, people can jump in, but also use your virtual hand to make sure that I see you. And when I see the virtual hand, I can call you in. But does anybody have any questions about or comments about that opening gambit?
Pete, wondering if you could expand upon why you think he said God is the God of negation. And very much sounds like Simone Weil, that originally, right, God negated, but what does Altizer sort of give us evidence that we're now in the phase of God is negation, and what were we in before God, the God of affirmation? But and then if we're following the Hegelian logic, it's like, okay, so God may have been affirmative in the past. Well, point of view is negative, but then at some point he went affirmative, and now we're gone negative. Is this just the second step in the Hegelian, and then there'll be a negation? But say more about why Altizer says we are clearly it's the God of negation, what's happening right now.
Yeah, and John, did you want to comment on that comment, or if you got a different question? Because that's fine. I just want to, if you're on the same line as Bill.
Yeah, is my microphone working? Because I was having some problems. Okay, perfect. Yeah, I guess look, I'm not an expert on Altizer, but I have been, familiar with his ideas for a while now. And I guess for me, there's always a certain kind of vagueness that I'm not entirely sure what it is in concrete terms that he's speaking about always. Because, and this is the very difficult thing, is that, like, okay, so we could argue over what exactly God is and let's say what the reversal of traditional theism in Hegel is, and there's all these debates that come together, and so we know that Hegel does something different. But what does Hegel mean when he says, the destruction of traditional metaphysics? Is that something like post-metaphysical theory in the 20th century? Is he doing something different? And so I guess for me, the primary problem is, like, we use words like negation, we use words like nothingness, but each thinker has their own idiosyncratic understanding of these. And so, like, when Altizer appeals to Hegel, like, I merely just haven't read enough Altizer to understand his interpretation of what that is, right? So there's like this, it's nested within so many different levels that I guess I'm just, even though I have an inkling of what he's trying to get at, like, when we talk about negation of negation, right? There's different interpretations of what precisely that means. Theodor Adorno went in his direction with negative dialectics, and then you have the more substantial right Hegelian tradition that comes out of that. So there's all these things, and I can't quite place where Altizer is in that.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's very good. I feel the same. I actually feel that this is maybe the clearest Altizer I've read. There's an essay in the book. I think it's called The Death of God. It's a book of essays from the 1960s, and there's also quite a clear essay by Altizer in that. But I remember reading the Gospel of Christian Atheism, and I came out more baffled than enlightened. So yeah, the one thing that I'd say, Bill, is that I think of him, and see if this makes sense to anybody, but he's such a historical thinker that in some respects, when I read him, he's kind of reading the unfolding of history. And so the unfolding of history is like he just sees how the history of Christian thought and history of Western thought has gone through these dialectical reversals. And God is this is the I guess this is the genealogy of God. This is the history of God. And he doesn't think outside of history. So for him, when he's talking about this new kind of this understanding, because in this chapter he does contrast it, which I'm quite glad is, because I always am contrasting radical theology with mystical theology, as you all know. And I thought he did it quite clearly here, which he definitely respects mystical theology a lot. But he says, mystical theology was a self and historical product, kind of pre-atheism. So it had abyss, it had void, it had desolation, negation, it has all of that in it. But with the notion of this plentitude, this Platonic ideal. But radical theology has to pass through the crucible of modernity. Modernity is a historical movement that it happened in history. It's a repetition, but it's a repetition that creates something new and something different. And so the theological response is looks different in relation to modernity and the negation of modernity. So I don't know. Yeah, Bill, I don't. That's not really answering you. But you see how, yeah, he's such a historical thinker that he just seems to think about how does theology continue to understand itself in the ongoing dialectic unfolding of history.
Yeah, no, that's helpful.
I don't know.
I'll read it 20 more times and see some more.
Yeah, I don't know. Like, I'm the same as you. I'm just kind of like I'm trying to wrestle through
Yeah,
it.
so I think what I hear you saying, he's not like, he's not going crazy with Hegel, like positive, very strongly negative. He's just saying there's been this gradual unfolding, and we're just in this phase right now, and there have been these modernist philosophers that are putting out some really strong things. So current zeitgeist is just like, atheism. But is he just kind of like, is he saying something new? I guess not. He's just sort of explaining the history of God, right? And so I think early on you said we don't know what God looks like now. I mean, earlier things we read, Altair said, death of God. Well, there's death of God, but we don't know what's going to come after. As a historian, you would never predict the future, right? So he's just saying we're in this phase where there's a lot of abyss and negativity going on, and so that's sort of the God, the focus. I mean, science is our God, and things like that is our God, right? But he's not really saying how this new God is radically different than the old God per se. It's just a different way of conceptualizing God.
Well, okay, so throw into the mixes. I think Altizer wants to say right or wrong. I think he wants to say, but that there's probably no reversals. Well, he does talk about reversals, but he goes, but I think
that's a progress. Yeah.
And so almost I like, unless there was kind of some sort of nuclear war or something, I kind of think that he goes, it's not that, this is just happens to be the time we're in and things will change. I think he sees it as a necessary unfolding and a necessary, as you say, progression, or a necessary, like, I don't think he thinks we can go back to the mystical understanding, or we can go back to.
Oh, nor should we. But how is it substantially different than the good old days?
Okay, I'll say one quick thing and then someone else jump in, because I don't want to dominate this, but I'm enjoying this conversation, and I'm allowed to slightly dominate, I guess. what he, and what I suppose what I would say is different, but definitely what he would say is different, is I think he would say that there has not been a conception of God as pure negation before. That's only possible in modernity, because in modernity, this notion of negation kind of comes to its zenith in atheism. And so only in the aftermath of modernism can a theology of radical negation fully blossom. I think that's what he would say. Does anybody have any thoughts on that? Or yeah.
It was really helpful to me. Is my mic on?
Yep.
Oh, okay. It was really helpful for me, you comparing him to Simone Weil, because this thing of saying God is nothing and the negation on the same time. Yeah, he's jumping between the two all the time. But Bill, you were asking what is special about him, and I get into this. Yeah, he's going through history, and that's interesting too. In another book, he's on the self or the subject. But then on the other side, it's like he's trying to found his own theology with all those pairs of sin and grace and so on. And he becomes very biblical, almost in some of the points classic in his theology. And I don't know, yeah, I would love some thoughts of that, because it's like he has this philosophical side, and that's one thing, and the history, and then he has this other way of doing theology. I see the philosophical theology, but I also sometimes see some classical also relating to the epics and so on.
Yes, absolutely. And actually, Heidi, you're one of the reasons why we're doing Altizer, because you're talking
you.
Altizer in Belfast. And I was like, yes, we have to do some Altizer. So thank you for that. Yeah, no, just to echo that, I mean, Altizer brings in some fascinating literary examples. Like Blake is centrally important to him. Joyce is centrally important to him. And then, of course, he is a proper theologian. And so he is building on Augustine and the Apostle Paul, and there's all these classical elements to what Altizer's doing as well. But did you have, sorry, I got in just echoing that, was there a question in that or just a comment?
I'm challenged by that he on the same time as, yeah, now he's taken this negative theology. This is where we are at. Yeah, but all of these, do you say dichotomies?
Oh yeah.
Is that what you call? Yeah, yeah. All of his dichotomies is very, in a way, very classic. And what I'm wrestling with is his apocalyptic thinking, and maybe that relates a lot to that. Yeah, I was just wondering about him doing the philosophy at one point, what you were aiming at, and then he has all this that is in some way basic biblical classical theology.
Yes, yes.
And I'm wondering how he's putting it together.
Yes.
Maybe that's why he's so complex, because I find this book quite challenging reading. Yeah.
Oh yeah, very challenging. And it gets more, I'm only in chapter 3 at the moment, and I think chapter 3, and I think it becomes more challenging as it goes. You know, it's a tough.
I read it early on, so yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, but could you say something about those two things together?
Yeah, I'll say one thing and I say jump in anybody else. Like at its core, how I think he connects his radically, let's call it heretical view, and with orthodoxy is the way I go about it is at a fundamental level. him and Vey as well, Veil, as you say, I can never know how to pronounce her surname, is that both of them see in Christianity kenosis, radical self-emptying, as central and to Christianity and to the notion of God. And if that idea of radical negation, radical self-emptying is central to Orthodox Christianity, then that's what connects the two. Like that's what connects this completely crazy notion of like nothing, negation, atheistic theology, the death of God, all of that stuff connects very radically with the earliest hymn that was ever written, which is in one of Paul's writings, where he says, it talks about Jesus considering himself nothing, took on the nature of a servant. And so this kind of absolutely crazy Althusserian theology connects very fundamentally with this idea of the very creation, in Simone Weil's terms, is the self-emptying of God, is the destruction and the death of God. And so in one sense, these modern thinkers are saying that modernity is a great gift of Christianity, not just to Christianity, but it's a great gift of Christianity. And one of its gifts is pushing this negativity to such an extreme that you find it in the art, in the culture, in the literature, in the science, and everything. And actually, this has a cruciform form. If we affirm this, it becomes a theological gesture. So that's why I see what Althusser is being connected with the Christian tradition, even though what he says is also so, in some sense, discordant with it. But jump in, anybody else?
Well, maybe I could build off of that, unless Chris, are you going to take us in a completely different direction, or?
I was going to, well, okay. I can take us in all sorts of directions because I've got over 30 comments on my copy of this chapter. I think I kind of object to Althusser, and in the same way as Pete, considering mysticism as a philosophical concept. I don't think it's a philosophical concept. I think it's a mode of perception. And that mode of perception inevitably, to my mind, brings us up against the inadequacy of language to express what is real and what is experienced. But that's kind of by the by. The thing that most bothers me about Althusser's position is that it reifies nothingness. And I don't like reifying nothingness. It feels utterly wrong to me. It's not a something, it's nothing. And if you start using it as a something, I think you're going to make an awful lot of mistakes along the way. That's as much as I'll go into at this point, because the other stuff goes elsewhere.
Well, thank you for that, Chris. I would have thought nothing less, and we'll come back to those. This is the perennial kind of like conversation, which I love. But here, John, jump in with where you were going to go.
Well, I guess, look, building off of what Chris said, in terms of reifying nothingness, I think there's a question that I have for Althusser, and I know he passed away already, so this is metaphorically speaking. I don't know if he's doing something different from what he did in his previous texts, like his earlier work when he's in the 1960s. This is the death of God movement and this entire thing. and he wrote Gospel of Christian Atheism and what was it, Radical Theology and the Death of God, I think was
That's
the
yes,
two
that was the
books
one.
that he came out with. And because the way that I originally understood those, let's say, early texts, was that what Althusser was trying to do was to say, look, if you have this transcendent reality above the immanent world, then that sort of drains the meaning off of our actual lived experience in the world, so that what Christianity does is it within its own theological framework sort of subverts that idea of radical transcendence that then drains the meaning from everyday concrete lived experience. I kind of read him as a Nietzschean who's essentially saying you need this life affirming relationship to the world, except that he thinks that you can do this within Christianity. Here it seems like what he's trying to do is to deify nihilism. And I feel like those are two, or at least that's like he mentions nihilism and absolute nothingness so much. And I wonder if there's I wonder if like he's almost reifying this sort of nihilistic framework. And I don't quite know what he means by it, but I'm assuming that what he's essentially doing in his shift is that in his early work, if he thought that the problem was that we have this radical transcendence that we have this dichotomy between radical transcendence and the immanent world, and if we can kind of see God in kenosis and the crucifixion as closing this gap between the two, and this is what I think he means by the death of God. It seems like in this text he's saying that doesn't go far enough, and what we actually need to do is just to embrace radical nihilism, because that's sort of the last vestiges of transcendence, I guess. But I don't know quite what, I guess the problem is I don't know what he means by that in a practical sort of sense. Like, what does it mean for politics? What does it mean for the church? What does it mean for society? I don't know if he's going to clear that up. I only read through the first chapter. Maybe he gets to it in chapter 3. You read ahead, so but like I don't know where this is going.
Yeah. Like,
Yeah,
Oh, Bill, go for it.
just quickly. Usually the art, poetry, music thing doesn't hit me, but I really resonated with him mentioning Cezanne, Monet, Van Gogh. And so he said they're bringing chaos into our everyday existence, right? And so I'm less fond of the term nothingness or abyss, and as a dualist, more into chaos. Yeah, Van Gogh is Starry Night. That's chaos, in what we see at night, and it's not the traditional view of things. And Monet, all these things, right? So that's practically what it looks like. So it's not this 2D art that's just very prescribed and very rigid. It's this much richer view of the world. So I think the goodness here is it's a richer experience. That's why I'm asking, how is it different? It's a richer experience. It's not just, okay, been there, done that with positive stuff. Let's try negative because we're bored with that. There is some progress, right? It's not just a change for change's sake. There is some progress, right? So, clearly those painters are superior to painters from the time of Christ or 1,000, 2,000 years after. So there's this, and I would see it more as an embracing of both. I wouldn't say there's nothing positive. It's just like, and so I think there is a sublation in those sorts of paintings, and it's so much richer than the other extreme. I don't get a lot of a black square and a white canvas. That would be like the nihilistic perfect painting. But there's this, chaotic life and vibrancy that we see in these 20th century painters that, late 19th. It's just very different. And in terms of theology and connecting it, so I think he says he wants to do a negative theology. It's time to do negative theology, and there's some richness there, which, of course, since it's new to us and strange to us, more needs to be said. But so it's not just a different version of God. So the key thing he says there is we are connected or made in the image of God. So if we have a negative theology that God is this negation, we are as well, right? So that's back to Lacan, or connecting Lacan to a negative theologian like Altizer, right? It's the same thing. It's just, if you're talking about God, that's the big mirror to understand yourself. So to the extent that God is negation, or God is, the deepest abyss of negation, we are as well, because we are in the image of God. So it very much, as Heidi mentioned, affects the subject. So you have to read this and then read in terms of practical application, what does it mean for the subject?
That's very well said. Very well said, because he mentions that about the kind of the negation that we are and negation that God is. And I started to look up. I was never a big fan of Cézanne. It just never resonated with me, but I was looking at those paintings up as I was reading, and it gave me a new appreciation of them. And if anything, I'm trying to link what Altizer's saying with like the political project of McGowan and Zizek, and even some of the scientific kind of revolutions that are coming out of physics, and kind of saying, are there similarities between all of those? But Hugh, jump in.
I hope I'm not restating what people have said, but I appreciated John using the word vague. I think that's one of the things that I'm struggling with a lot of his writing. And he sort of started out by talking about the anonymous God, and then all of a sudden we're dealing with absolute nothingness. And I was kind of like, now how did we get from there to there? And as I was reading him, it seems like he brings in his own kind of Gnostic dualisms. And maybe like Chris, I'm just being overly defensive. Not that you're being overly defensive, but when he talks about apophatic mysticism, can be known as a profoundly backward movement, a backward movement to primordial Godhead. But apocalypticism is inevitably a profoundly forward movement. And he never really has to justify that. It's just he sees one as being further developed than the other. And what I don't get is, I could see apophatic mysticism being a profoundly present, non-backward looking thing, unless you take the idea of wanting to prove a God, unless you're using it to shore that up. But for me, I don't know why apocalypticism is any better than an apophatic mysticism. I don't know if anyone read that or read that differently, but maybe I'm just reading it wrong. I don't know.
Yeah, okay. I'll give an attempt at a Altizer response and see what you think, because it's a very good question. So what would Altizer say? I mean, he said better than how I'm going to say it, but in a way, so Altizer is committed to this idea of the kind of gradual unfolding of history through dialectic movement. So if you accept that, then always a type of dialectic thinker like Altizer is always going to privilege what he calls repetition over recollection. Always, because for a dialectician like that, you always have to go all the way in to the affirmation. You go all the way in, it becomes a negation, you go all the way in. And so there's this kind of movement of like, you don't run away from the gunfire, you run into it. Now, because of his commitment to that, I'm almost thinking, like, by definition, apophatic theology is going to feel like a movement back to a time in history that where it was innovative, where it created great poetry, great literature, great innovations within the church, and even potentially within mathematics and science. I don't know, but probably would say, yes, it had its day in history. But then he would say, but now with the advent of modernity, it's an inherently backward movement, and apocalypticism is an inherently forward movement. So the logic of Altizer, I think, will always be fully embrace and go into the historical moment. Now, I'm not saying that he's right for doing that, but is that kind of give any clarity to like why Altizer kind of is affirms apocalypticism over apophatic theology, which, by the way, I like those two A's. I'm going to use that. And
Yeah, no, thank you. That's very helpful in terms of just putting him in a particular place. I just don't happen to buy
yeah,
it.
agree. Yes, buy it, exactly. Yes, yes. Yeah.
But I have to torpedo this a tiny bit, the best that I'm able to, and because right, there might be a fundamental problem to this way of thinking, and because it's predicated on the idea that there's a grand narrative which is progressing forward, and this is like this is the elephant in the room, in the sense that, I mean, look, we're kind of the weirdos here, right? Doing the radical theology thing, right? This is a small slice of sort of the philosophical tradition. And he's picking out particular philosophers and theologians that he finds useful, and then treating them as if they're the representative of the world spirit, to use the Hegelian terminology. And right, it's not clear that he's right in detecting this trajectory within philosophy itself, much less the Western world, and then much less the world kind of as a whole. And so I guess in kind of an kind of a methodological framework, he's doing, right, it's kind of like when Hegel said that world history is completed in the Prussian state. There's something that there's something that's very impossible to justify, and it's like, he's treating the secularization hypothesis that the world is essentially going to move to this atheistic, secular, uh, humanistic phase of development, as if that isn't, not happening, as if religion is actually growing around the world. And I don't know how he would justify picking out the particular thinkers that he likes and then drawing this as the trajectory of world history.
Yeah.
Like,
Yes.
that for me is difficult to overcome.
Yes, no, that's true. Here's what here's the only possible, I think the only possible answer to that, and it's probably not effective enough. And I think it's Charles Taylor uses this argument to some extent, is that you're right. Yeah, and this is very interpretive, but Altizer might want to say that it's where the greatest thinkers and artists and kind of the musicians and writers, the kind of the zeitgeist, the pinnacle of an epoch, is what is going on there. So technically, you could have, for example, fundamentalist revivals. You could have, whatever, but it's where is, yes, as you said, where is world history moving forward? Where is the world spirit moving forward? And so he might want to make an argument that you look at today, some of the great movements in mathematics and in science have all been around this idea of negation in philosophy, but it's a hard argument to make necessarily,
Right, it kind of reminds me of Francis Fukuyama and world politics. If anybody knows, right, I think it was 1989, Francis Fukuyama wrote this article and then subsequently a book called The End of History, and he basically used Hegelian theory to say that history is over, liberal democracy beat fascism and it beat communism. And now he's given a lot of interviews lately, and I've been listening to these while I exercise and work out. And people ask him, it's like, well, everybody said that China was going to become a liberal democracy, and now we have war between Russia and the collective West in Eastern Europe. And people ask him, like, it doesn't seem like the arc of history is moving towards the triumph of liberal democracy. And he's like, well, yeah, but like the cutting edge, the ideal content is still liberal democracy. There's nothing else that can challenge it, even though the entire world isn't really moving in that direction. He's kind of like, well, the most developed ideas are the liberal democratic ideas, but he's struggling to actually justify this as his theories kind of being disproved throughout the world, and it's just that's what it kind of reminds me of.
Yeah, no, that's very good. And yeah, and so I like the subtle dig is like, because I'm quite partial to that idea, but as soon as you mentioned Fukuyama, I'm laughing because going, yeah, that's the problem, is you have to find all these ways of going, oh yeah, but that's just reactionary, small, you know, kind of like reversal that's not significant in world history. And you know, how many times can you say that before it becomes unconvincing? Yeah. Anybody else want to jump in, take a start? Oh, Heidi? Oh, your microphone's off.
Yeah, I'm on. Yeah, I'm just I'm very curious to read Altar's dissertation because it's on apocalypticism. Apocalypticism, yeah. And to me, it seems like some of his thought, especially his theology, takes its outset exactly there. Yeah, somehow, yeah. Anybody has a comment? Have you read dissertation? Yeah.
Oh, you know, I haven't read his dissertation. Has anybody?
It's like his earliest book. I think I just ordered it on Amazon, but yeah, it's yeah.
Yeah, no, but but you're right that apocalypticism is a central theme from the very beginning, you know, and I've always kind of like, well, you know, it's been interesting how that's, you know, to understand exactly what he means by it. I think in this chapter, he defines it very simply. I think it's good, which is an absolute end that is an absolute beginning. And actually, Matt was referencing before we started here, an interview I did on a podcast called, what was it called? The Liminal podcast. And I talked about the peace process in Northern Ireland as being an apocalyptic process. Because in a way, an apocalypse is an absolute end, and you don't really know what's going to happen after it, but something new erupts. It's an absolute end and an absolute beginning. And yeah, that notion has been central to him from the very beginning, but I haven't read
Yeah.
that.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
In this, I would like to compare him to Caputo, because Caputo also have this, what can you say, this outset of, yeah, the whole thing of the event, something new is happening. And it will change what is coming. An event will change whatever is coming. The future will be different just because of that.
Yes.
So yeah, there I see a parallel between the two, apocalypse and yeah, the event somehow.
Oh, 100%, 100%. And actually, you know, you're reminding me that like there could be an argument that, you know, not all ties are necessarily, but when you look at people like Caputo, you look at process theology, you look at evental philosophy, and you look at, you know, some stuff like with Gödel's and completeness theorem, but you kind of go, well, you know, maybe an argument can be made that negation in philosophy and theology and science is having its day. Like, you know, that is something that in the last 100 years has been very significant in a variety of fields. You know, you mentioned Caputo again. I go like, you know, postmodernism and postmodern theology was, you know, one of the more significant philosophical and theological movements of the last 50 years, you know. So you know, so an argument might be made that those process and post-structural philosophies and have done more than evangelical and fundamentalist theologies, had more productive outworkings, more fruit. I don't know.
I was also thinking of, when you talk of his approach to history, he almost become modern. Yeah, his whole thing of thinking, what are we? Yeah, the whole development theory that everything is better.
Oh yes. Oh yeah. Yes. Yeah.
Sometimes it almost becomes modern there, though I'm sure he would disagree.
Yes, I was wondering that myself, and I used the word progress, going, you know, I'm sure he would disagree with that. but it's also, you can see a kind of progression of history that potentially in his work, and John mentioned that as well. So yeah, that's not as popular an idea, and like I don't buy into that teleological outfolding of history. Yeah. Oh, Chris, jump in.
Well, if I can just enter another issue, he's very down on Gnosticism, which he sees as being a countervailing force to Orthodox Christianity in the early days, which is not particularly historically accurate. There wasn't a Gnosticism, there were a load of Gnosticisms that went in various different directions. There was some common-ish threads. Looking at the Cathars is interesting as a way that we could have gone but didn't. But the common thread of Gnosticisms is that they all thought they had the magic decoder ring for Scripture. And it occurs to me that Altizer also thinks he has the magic decoder ring for Scripture. And so he's an arch Gnostic.
Yeah, but every Christian faith claims they have that decoder ring.
No, I'm very comfortable with plural meanings of Scripture.
So Chris, I was going to speak on your behalf the following way: process theology. So, is process theology perhaps a better approach than swinging wildly from all positive to all negative? And so I sort of got from Altizer, he said, what's unique to Christianity is it went way too far. The pendulum swung from the Greek gods or whatever gods were back to like, God is absolutely perfect. All the omnis, he's absolutely perfect. And like, seriously, there might be a few critiques of that. And so is it perhaps the case that he's saying the Greek and Roman god system was better because there were self-divided gods and we didn't go to these extremes and they were more a mirror image of us or vice versa? And so should we go back to the Greek and Roman gods where like they have a good day and a bad day? But I think process theology is the 20th century equivalent to that. It's like, well, God doesn't control everything, but he's good and he kind of loves us and he'll try and make things move in a good direction. So is process theology potentially where Altizer is recommending we be now?
It seems to me that Altizer, as most of the rest of theology, is locked into substance ontology, and process is not substance ontology. Process
or extremes, right? Process is like, yeah, God's pretty good most of the time. He doesn't control everything. He's pretty powerful. He's more powerful than most of the Marvel superheroes, which is good enough. But he's not like controls everything, knows every hair in your head, knows every move you're going to make. That was like way too extreme, not useful.
Certainly
not helpful.
Certainly the open and relational people would agree with that. Hardline process people might say that that's going too far towards a substantive God rather than a process God. Now, I find it very difficult to think process properly because my brain is so trained
so just don't get caught up in the word process. It's like
quality.
I think Altizer wrote, the Yahweh, he was this God that sometimes would kill people if he got mad, and then it slowly evolved to the Christian, and he went through, the Augustinian, God's absolutely perfect. He's never going to make a mistake. Is absolutely perfect, and there's nothing good in this world. All the good is in, as John said, sucked out into God's heaven is the only good thing. Everything here is like, no, I mean, process is, it's not process. Process like, get real. God doesn't know absolutely everything, but he's a powerful, positive force. And that's what I mean by process.
Possible. He's a
Yeah, that sounds like, yeah, you mentioned, Chris, the difference between kind of relational and the hardline process, because the relational ones have that kind of more notion of God as kind of like not all knowing, all powerful. And then from my limited reading of the process people is more God is the process. Is that right? Kind of
Yes,
is the name for
that
the process
that
itself.
would be right, and everything should be thought of in terms of process.
Yeah.
And nobody I've read so far, including Whitehead and Bergson, puts it in a way that I can't pick holes in, from the point of view of, well, it's a bit too substance and substance.
Well, no, but I think it's
always.
both, right? So events happen, and then God has a process to process those events. But God doesn't create all the events. God, again,
No,
there's no change if God is just processed or relational. I mean, he's controlling all the processes. He knows exactly all the events. Point is, he doesn't know everything. He can't predict everything. Things will happen, and he will, go with the flow and go in a
yeah,
positive way.
yeah.
He's not
But there's
controlling
actually
absolutely everything, right?
there's actually an echo further on in the chapter of something very Whiteheadian. Whitehead talks in terms of the primordial and consequent natures of God, and Altizer talks about the primordial and apocalyptic natures of God. And I don't know whether that link works very well yet, but I noted it on the way past.
Also, Cobb and Altizer were very good friends. I just remembered I was actually going to look up because I think isn't it John Cobb was his name? I
Yeah,
forget.
John Cobb.
John Cobb, yeah, because John Cobb wrote a very well-known, I think, review of one of Altizer's books, and I think had a very positive kind of like a different, but saw Altizer very as a really respected him. So I want to look into that relationship a little bit.
And Pete,
Altizer be turning in his grave, by the way. You called him substantive theologian. I don't think he'd like that. Sorry, Bill, go for it.
and can you, if you know, can you say why Zizek loves Altizer?
Yeah, I can tell you a tiny bit about the history there. Is that Zizek had not read any Altizer because Altizer's theologian. A guy called Adam Kotsko wrote a book called Zizek and Theology. This is about 15 years ago now, maybe. And said in there that there was a real similarity between, what Zizek was doing and what Altizer had been doing. So Zizek went and read Altizer and liked what he read. And then they actually had a couple of things together. There's one of them online. You can see Zizek and Altizer sharing a podium. And the reason why Zizek, kind of really took to Altizer is, in a sense, Altizer is the Hegelian theologian. I mean, even though Hegel can be read in lots of different ways, like I think, and see, John, if you would agree or not, but that like in terms of the 20th century theologians, Altizer probably has the best claim to being the Hegelian theologian and death of God theologian, which means that, and which obviously Zizek, complements Zizek in many ways. John, do you agree with that or not? By the way, just to go,
I don't know. I mean, Karl Barth's engagement with Hegel is, at least in terms of influence, it kind of depends. Look, I'll agree with you in terms of self-conscious sort of
yes.
putting it out there. In terms of like historical dissent, I don't know if I would.
Yeah. No, yeah, I just wanted to call you just because in case you had a very clear kind of figure you wanted to mention. But yeah, but I'd take that on the absolutely. And oh yeah, and here, Courtney, jump in. By the way, we're on 5 past. I usually go to about a quarter past, so we'll kind of have a few more thoughts. And Courtney, jump in.
With the question of whether or not Altizer is the Hegelian of the 20th century, I read somewhere when I was reading up on him, and I don't know where it was, somebody said that he was the quintessential William Blake philosopher. And I haven't read enough of William Blake to judge that one way or the other. I just wanted to see what all of you thought of that.
Yep. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like Blake and Hegel, are two of his primary people, and then Joyce, I think, as well. But I don't know my Blake at all, hardly. So if anybody else has a comment on that, jump in. But it is funny that, you know, for an Altizer then ended up teaching literature in a university, kind of died, like in a sense of as a public figure, and went and taught literature and basically became a Blake expert. But yeah, but saw Blake as an apocalyptic death of God thinker. But yeah, it looks like we're all the same. We don't know our Blake, so no one's going to jump in there. Yeah. Anyone
Well, I
else?
guess I know what I'm going to be reading next.
Yes, I know. I've tried to read Blake a few times, but I have to confess I'm not very good with poetry. Yeah. Any other, like, in the last few minutes? Anybody else want to jump in? Oh, Matt, please.
Okay. So the apocalyptic notion appeals to me and interests me especially if we think of it as a negation, at a moment where we come to an absolute impasse, right? And maybe even a collapse. And then something we have been mentioning today comes out of that. Mm-hmm. And I'd like to say that I think of that which comes out of that as a truth based on that event, and perhaps as the only truths that we have to refer to anymore. If there is no big other, if God is dead, if, you know, I mean, the whole thing, right? That there's nothing that we can refer to. We have different ideas here, what God is doing, this or that or the other, as we talked about today. But that which comes out of that total impasse as a truth and as an evental truth, not a truth that's applicable to everyone and for at different scenarios, but that is the truth, like I said, of the event. And I think maybe that's, for me, that's what we have. That's what I have, and I think it's actually very powerful. And it certainly relieves me of telling other people how things are and should be.
Yes. So. Yeah, if I hear you correctly, I think this is a very great insight. Is that so for someone like Altizer, who's an historical thinker, you can't have reference to some sort of truth out there. The truth is imminently revealed through, as you say, the impasse, through the dialectical movement. And so it's not that, yes, it's not that for someone like Altizer, we can therefore reference some external truth, but rather, through the outpouring of history, the negation of theism comes fully in modernity, with kind of the negation of God and atheism. And then out of that impasse arises the idea potentially of, God as the negation. But all of these movements are not some reference to some external truth. They're imminently revealed through this dialectical process. And that's what I hear you saying, and I think that's very insightful if that's what you're saying. But I think that's I think how Altizer thinks of the unfolding of truth. Hence, he's not referencing like this idea of God as negation, as he's not referencing some external truth. Okay, that's all eternally true. That's always been true, and now we finally revealed it. But rather that, in a sense, that's the revelation of truth in history, in this moment, through the dialectical process. Anyway.
Thank you.
Courtney.
Okay. Completely different direction here. As I was reading, I came across this word reification. Had no idea what it meant. So I had to look it up. So I wanted to run something past you guys to see if I'm understanding this correctly. So the example that I read in the definition that was paired with the definition said that reification would be if you're taking the concept of home, like the abstract idea of home, and you're removing all of the abstract about it, and the only thing you think of as home is this physical building that you have your activities and your life in. And my question is, if that is a correct interpretation of reification, if that is a correct application of it, is that why, for instance, the American Supreme Court feels comfortable with allowing cities to determine, allowing cities to make it illegal for people to sleep outside, because they have reified the concept of home and homelessness to this idea of just the bare bones. You have to have a physical building. You don't get to have this abstract concept. Is this making any sense at all?
Yes, I actually very much like that definition of reification as well, by the way. That was very good. So you said you take a concept like home, but you remove its abstract notions, and so you're just left with this concrete notion of home as a physical building. Yeah, that's a nice definition. But John, do you have something to say about that? Because
Well, I'm going to go in the opposite direction because I was going to disagree with the conception. Now, let me just preface by saying really quickly that it's possible that certain people use reification in a sense that's different from, the original sense of it, but at least my understanding of the historical development of the term and how it's mostly used comes from Marxist theory. And so I believe it was invented by, wasn't it Georg Lukács, I think, who first used the term. I could be wrong on that, but he's the one who kind of popularized it in Marxist theory. And I guess I see reification as being the transformation of something that's a result of the social process and social forces being conceptualized as a thing, right? So, and I can use an example of this from Lacan, because I think Lacan has a very similar instance of this, and Zizek talks about it. I know, Peter, you've mentioned this example before, right? So think about the idea of what it means to be a king, right? This is Zizek beats this example to death, but the idea is that what it means to be a king is a product of the social process, right? There's no kingness, there's no majesty that exists in you as a unique individual person. All the powers, all the status, all the authority of a king is the product of the social structure. It's the fact that the symbolic order that the people in your kingdom, your subjects, give you the social role of being the king. And therefore, reification would be the idea that the substance, that the power, that the authority exists within the thing would be that reification is when you transform something that's part of the social process and place it into the thing itself.
Okay.
which actually is not dissimilar maybe from what you were saying with that example, maybe in that, or it's the other direction, but it's like something like, yes, whenever you think of having a home purely divorced from all of its social relations and its abstract thinking, that's a reification. I don't know if that's actually, am I trying to make this, am I hearing that being the same or not? Because that's a great example, obviously, is when, Lacan famously said, whenever a homeless person thinks they're a king, they're mad, but so is a king who thinks they're a king, right? They're just as mad, which is a brilliant way of saying that a king who really thinks they're a king has reified their social relations and think that their kingliness is in them. Yeah.
Okay, well, all of that definitely helps. So thank you. I am going to continue trying to comprehend this concept.
Yes.
But it does help. It helps to talk through it a bit.
And what about other concepts in this? Like, so were people comfortable with repetition and recollection? We've talked about apocalypse. I mean, there's a fair few technical terms that were in this chapter. I thought recollection and repetition was an important one because they can be deceptively difficult, but they're, you know, very Kierkegaardian ideas. But recollection, you probably get this, but is the remembering of a past, or the trying to bring back the past. Repetition, I always think of it in terms of evolution, because evolution is like the repetition where cells replicate themselves, but they repeat in a different environment with different internal and external constraints. So the repetition is also difference. So, you know, whenever Altizer's talking about repetition rather than recollection, again, it's the idea of you can't really look back. People do and whatever, but it's not going to be that effective. But repetition is about repeating, but with innovation and with difference.
If it's any help in that bit of the chapter, I wrote in the margin the quote, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
Nice. Yes, nice. Very true. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. That's very Kierkegaardian, which is we go back to the themes of guilt and meaninglessness, and these themes rhyme with the past, but they look different in different contexts and epochs. Very good. Yeah. All right, well, here we'll finish up, but I would imagine if you're up for it, let's do another week of Altizer. I'm going to suggest that I send you the article from an early article from that book that John mentioned, I think Radical Theology and the Death of God, because I think from what I remember, that's also quite a good essay of Altizer's. So it's either that or chapter 2 of this book. I am actually completely happy either way. Can we do a virtual show of hands? Who would like to do chapter 2 of this book? Keep it simple. Raise your virtual or real hand. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. And then who would like an article from an earlier Altizer? There's one. And a half. There's 1.5.
If the article will help me understand him better, then I'm for the article. If it will confuse me further, then no, let's just go on.
Yeah.
So,
What is chapter 2 here? I'm just going to look very quickly. Does anybody know it off the top of their heads? I'm going to try
No, but I do know that I already bought the physical book that's being shipped, so I'm very much invested in continuing reading this as opposed to digging through my giant pile of books downstairs and trying to find Radical Theology of the Death.
A tiny book. Okay, well, listen.
Primordial Sacrifice.
Primordial Sacrifice. Okay, let's do it. But you know what I'll also do? I will still send just the article just so you have it if I can find it. But yeah, let's do chapter 2 next week, and I'll see you all there. Take care.
Okay. Bye.